Over the last couple of weeks, we have talked about the Chinese economy and the struggles that they are going through. I want to step back and acknowledge and say, hey, yes, they are in trouble. But I want to talk about us back home. What might a struggling Chinese economy mean for the US economy? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it both? We're going to talk about this with a 10-year Wall Street veteran, Mr. Taylor from Life Goal Investments. How you doing, sir?
I'm excited for this one because this is macroeconomics at its finest. And how do companies, multinational, interrelate with each other? And what does it do at the end of the day for underlying economies? What does it do at the end of the day for underlying investments? Because that's what we're speaking to here.
Yeah, so probably the most talked about thing in the United States today, at least economically, is inflation,
Yep.
right? So why don't we start there, right? We should all know that China is a big producer of stuff that gets consumed in the U.S. economy. I hope that's not a shock to anyone. But to say that the Chinese economy is struggling, what do you think, Taylor? Will that help or hurt the U.S. consumer?
I think all in all, I'm a believer in globalism. And I grew up in a small town and I love the made in America tag on something. And I do root for all of that. But essentially, when it comes to capitalism as a whole and getting money where it's best served, places like, hey, where can we get cheaper labor? Right. That's
Right.
an easy way to become more efficient. And, throughout the past 2, 3 decades, the answer to that question has been largely China or India or the Philippines, whatever it is, one of those East Asian countries have the technology to build a lot of the things that we have, but much more efficiently from a cost of labor perspective. And if that dissipates, what you're going to see is, when I say that, I mean the relationship geopolitically between ourselves and China and some other players and the BRICS, et cetera. If you start to see the onshoring of products, the natural realization is right, wrong, or indifferent, we pay our workers significantly more than they do. And so the input cost goes up, and that has to drive the top line cost of whatever good it is higher, which is undisputably an inflationary pressure.
Yeah, when I think about inflation, I'm glad you went there. There's actually two sides of the coin. One is, right, if the Chinese economy is struggling, their producers are going to do what all producers do and cut prices.
Yep.
So the stuff that they are still producing that we are buying probably go down,
Yep.
probably are truly deflationary, not disinflation or inflation, but deflation, lower prices. But to your point, there's been a clear pivot, change, improvement, whatever you want to call it, by saying, hey, we can no longer trust ABC. We need to make some of these things back home. And back home is more expensive. Now, I don't think that ripples through our economy in 2023. Maybe it shows up in late 2024 because it takes time to build manufacturing plants and do this and do that and all of that. It is one of the reasons that inflation will be sticky for the next 4 to 5 years because we are, bringing some manufacturing back home. But I think in the near term, we might see some like true deflation in stuff that China produces. Is that reasonable?
That's a reasonable thought. I I actually tend to think the other side of it. I think that there is more inflationary pressure based upon labor costs than there is deflationary pressure on goods. Because goods right now, we've seen essentially goods inflation roll over. Where we're seeing the pressure here in the United States is going to be on the service side. And so that is the reason it's service oriented, is because servers is almost all labor, right? And so if we take the labor component of the goods side and start to inflate that, that becomes a little bit of a scarier proposition for me. But maybe in the real immediacy, maybe you're right to say that, yeah, they're deflationary, because they legitimately are posting, and we've talked about this, deflation in their country right now. So that can have a real effect, and it can cause producers to say, like, oh boy, let's get this off the books while we can. And therefore I could see it. So I'll revoke my comment. I say, very near term, maybe it's a wash. I think longer term, you have the labor pressures forcing inflation higher. And we're seeing labor pressures everywhere right now, right? We
Yeah.
talked about UPS, but the UAW, United Auto
Yeah.
Workers, are
September.
September 14th. It's like, not to use a violent term, I won't even go there. Anyway, it's like the Russian roulette almost. It's just a violent term. My apologies there, but you get what I'm saying. Where
Yeah.
someone's got to give. Someone
Oh
has to
no,
give.
they're going to go on strike. They're frankly, they saw what UPS got. They saw what airline pilots got. All these
Yep.
folks see what other unions are getting, and they don't
Yep.
want to be seen as the weak union. They have
Yep.
130,000 members. They're gonna hold GM and Ford and some others hostage. Um, they're going. I mean, they have a strike fund of almost $1 billion, right? So, um,
That's what people don't realize is I think people don't realize is the preparation that goes into the front end of this, because they're like, hey,
right.
how could people possibly afford just to sit on the sidelines and not get a paycheck? That's what that strike fund is for.
Yeah, they got 875 billion or million. I don't know, whatever. A lot of money. I think it was almost $1 billion. So eight hundred
Yep.
seventy-five
And,
million.
and and they're saying from the headlines, and I haven't delved too far into this yet, but the UAW president has been more willing to strike in his
Oh,
history, and more rhetoric around striking than the
oh, it's
others have had.
happening. It's happening.
Yeah.
I mean, it's yeah. he yeah, it's happening. But now let's talk about something else that's been going on in China for a long time. Evergrande was started on my channel
Yep.
3 years ago.
Yep.
Town and Country, or whatever the other one is that's going now. Evergrande just filed bankruptcy in New York. They just started trading on the Hong Kong after like 2 years. They're down 80. It's
87%
garbage.
or something like
80
that. Yeah.
in a day, right? Only
Yeah.
better.com was worse at like 91% in a day. But anyways, um, where I'm going with this is Chinese real estate debt is a problem, to say
Yep.
the least.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
I
We
don't know
talked about
where
the prior
all,
episode of
yeah,
we talked in the prior episode about this here in our own country.
sure. But with Chinese debt, a lot of that is, in my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, is nationalized, meaning it exists in the Chinese ecosystem somewhere. It's not like, mom and dad have a Chinese bond that they're collecting 8% on in the US. But a
Correct.
lot of the real estate debt, I think, based on my fair amount of research, exists in China. Is that fair?
That is my understanding as well. And to your point, this is not a mom and pop going to a small local bank and saying, "Hey, we're going to cut a business deal on the back of a napkin between you and I." No,
Right.
Chinese is much more nationalized. Their banking system is much more nationalized, and therefore it gets put under a little bit larger of an umbrella, which can be seen as a good thing or a bad thing. Because at the beginning, if one of these small regional bank experiences stresses, it just shows up on their own balance sheet and they go under. But what you can have is these cracks start to form in lots of different places as things ravel up against a bigger umbrella, which is the overall Chinese banking system.
Yeah. Yeah. Essentially, again, one guy's outside opinion, it's nationalized, right? They can plug it up if they choose to do that. So I don't think there's a lot of bad debt. Maybe some of it exists on Wall Street, some in some insurance companies, but it's probably a relatively small percentage of direct impact of losses. I do know that some of their debt is dollarized, right? So it's not in yuan, it's in dollars. That debt could be a problem, right? They're already not paying those coupons. So there's going to be some pain felt there. So whoever owns the dollarized bonds, I think will feel some pain.
Yeah, and what's interesting is you just talk about the general debt level of the Chinese government and everything in general. And what you have is that since Xi Jinping took over, the current President Xi, you had their debt to GDP level go from 195% to 297%.
Oh my
So that's
gosh.
been, yeah, we talk about, stress testing here in the United States at 120, which is currently where we're at. Xi Jinping currently has taken their debt level in China against their GDP. So essentially, you're saying how much do you have outstanding versus how much you're making in any individual year, and it's 300%, 297 to be exact.
I had no idea. I did not know it was that high. That's
It's big.
crazy.
It's big.
Yeah. So again, I don't think there's any direct correlation from Evergrande's failure and whatnot to a lot of Americans. Again, maybe some mutual funds or Wall Street types, but it's probably small. I think the bigger question for me is, does the pain and fear of losses in China actually make US debt more attractive? And I think the answer is yes. And what does that mean? It means more demand, i.e., lower rates over time.
But
Am I
there's
missing
no
something?
way. Yeah, I totally agree. So you take a step back and you say, okay, well, let's look at Japan right now, because Japan has now opened up their bonds to have wider degrees of variability. And what it's done is increase the yield on their bonds incrementally. So their 10-year essentially JGB, which is, that their 10-year treasury essentially is yielding something like 0.5% right now. And what
Mm.
it's done is it's caused more buying on that JGB as it went from 0% to 0.5%. Now you look across the ocean in the United States, and we're at something like 4.25% on our
Right.
10-year treasury. And yet they're buying over here at 0.5%. So I think the realization is any incremental change in government debt causes things to shift and people to reassess where they're putting their money. And that absolutely can take place, what you've just described.
Yeah. So I think, and then the last thing, and I think we talked about this last time, the biggest fear I have is kind of number 4 or 5. I lost count where we are, is if the Chinese economy continues to collapse and civil unrest becomes more common or widely reported,
Sure.
Xi Jinping, he'll feel that. And he is clearly, I mean, he fenced in his citizens to apartment buildings. He will crack down hard, I think.
Yep, and we've discussed, what Wall Street is talking about a lot, and this was spoken about at the New York Stock Exchange when I was there last week, is the realization that this banter back and forth between China and everyone else that wants to hear the geopolitical echo chamber is that they are serious about Taiwan. They legitimately are now creating the propaganda or whatever it is that China owns Taiwan, and that makes a more real scenario playing out of them potentially invading Taiwan, and that has massive political ripple effects, massive economic ripple effects, all of that. But it is becoming more and more of what you call on Wall Street or investments tail risk. Tail risk is something that's not likely to play out, but something that has potentially a catastrophic, effect on the market. You have to have it considered in your portfolio at all times, and that is something that is becoming up more and more often.
Yeah, I think any leader who feels the stress and loss of support from his citizens is can make some desperate moves, and
Yep.
that certainly is a tail risk that is out there. Any other kind of thoughts on the Chinese economy struggling, on impact, good or bad, in the United States that I may have missed?
Yeah, I think the one thing, and I didn't, not trying to, I didn't think about it till right now. The one thing that kind of compounds the effect of all of this is the fact that people were so optimistic on China
Oh
as
yeah,
they got released essentially back into the world from COVID, right? So the expectations were so high. And now the reality of their economic growth is negative essentially, and
yeah.
so darn low that is why there's so much added unrest. Because when you say to people like, hey, when this floodgate gets open, watch out because the growth is coming, and then the floodgate gets open, and boy, it's the exact opposite result. If you want to talk about, the linchpin to adding more stress, there it is.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And again, I think what folks missed is they broke the psyche of the consumer, right? And they're afraid. They were, I don't know, I would argue, mistreated, scared, lied to. And when you are that person, you conserve, and you conserve hard. They've always been wonderful savers, if you believe the numbers. It's got to be 3, 4x what they used to be doing. They're like, no, I'm not getting caught again. I'm
Right.
gonna save, 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 save.
Fool
And
me once.
yeah, fool
Fool me
me
once.
once.
And
Exactly.
again, we've seen how this plays out, played out in Japan over the past 30 years. Like deflation is the death of an economy, unfortunately.
And then you add on to that horrible demographics. Oof.
Correct. That's exactly what played out in Japan, right?
Exactly, exactly. Well, there's a lot of stuff going on. You put out a lot of amazing stuff. You have something on the bricks and what folks on the New York Stock Exchange say about the bricks. Where should somebody go check that out?
Yeah, thanks so much. At Life Goal Investments, we're on both Instagram and TikTok. Again, it's at Life Goal Investments. I
Awesome,
appreciate you,
Mike.
Michael. Thank you.
Of course.